Good morning, everyone, and welcome to BCCK's webinar. And it's a pleasure to have a fantastic moderator and also panel today to discuss what's ahead for nuclear diplomacy in North Korea, particularly obviously with the election of the new administration in the US. And so we'll be looking at sort of likely diplomatic relations and how that may change relative to his predecessor, and how the North Korean regime may sort of reflect on that and also react to that. Potential challenges facing the administration, including Biden and Moon with the denuclearization process, or not, as the case may be, and also implications for deepening US-China tensions, as well as the Quad alliance, and also the economic crisis and its impact on relations between the two Koreas, particularly with what's going on in the north there. And today we have a fantastic moderator who I'd like to just quickly introduce, and then I'll leave Chad to introduce our speakers, who are returning speakers, Duyeon Kim and also Andrei Lankov. Great to have you back. So first of all, Chad is also my gym buddy, so that goes down as a major point in his profile. And he's also the founder of NK News, the genesis of NK Pro, which was founded in 2010 after visiting the DPRK, and also worked at the UN think tanks in DC, and also written for multiple newspapers. And he specializes in writing news and analysis. So thank you very much for joining us, Chad, this time as moderator, and I'll pass it over to you.
Good morning. Thanks, Sean, very much for the invitation to moderate this. And I'm very happy to be doing it with Duyeon and Andrei, two people I've worked on and off with over the last decade or so, actually, on North Korea issues. This is an interesting time for the Korean Peninsula. You've probably noticed North Korea has mostly been out of the news in the last 6 months or so. There's been not too much happening. There was initially a lot of speculation late last year, looking at past precedent, anticipation that we'd see North Korean nuclear tests, ICBM tests to greet the new Biden administration, but it hasn't really worked out like that. And while Trump inherited a White House, which he was issued a warning by former President Obama almost on day one that North Korea would be his top foreign policy challenge, that hasn't seemed to have crossed over into the Biden administration's priority list in quite the same way. And we are internally in North Korea facing a very, very different situation to 2016. We're seeing a country that is really probably one of the hardest hit by COVID-19, despite ostensibly having 0 cases of COVID-19. And that's because of the significant consequences their border shutdown is causing. So there's lots to talk about today on this subject. You've probably seen the biographies of our two speakers. I'll just give you some brief information. So Duyeon Kim is an Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Center for New American Security. She's worked in various think tanks around Washington, D.C., been a long time opinion leader on North Korea related issues. Andrei Lankov, he's a professor at Kookmin University, also regular contributor to our website, NK News. He lived in Pyongyang in the early 1980s as part of his foreign study program at Kim Il-sung University. So just to start out, Ms. Kim, could you give us your thoughts on where North Korea fits really right now in the US priority list? We have COVID-19, tension with China, Iran, domestic social problems. Where do you think North Korea stands right now in Washington's priority list?
Well, first, thanks so much for the BCCK for having me join this panel today and share some thoughts. To your question, Chad, that really remains to be seen. I think we've definitely heard administration officials say that North Korea is an important priority, but they're still doing various policy reviews, not just North Korea. They're doing the China review as well. And as you mentioned, they're really grappling with a lot of domestic, very urgent and important domestic issues on top of all the very significant and urgent foreign policy issues as well. And so we'll have to see where North Korea actually fares on on the presidential priority list. And I think we'll have a better idea after we hear more about their policy review, and also I think who they appoint as whether they keep the special representative for North Korea policy position or some sort of envoy position, or who is named that, whether they're dual-hatted as somebody who's already in government. I think all of those will be good signals as to how important and how high up on the list North Korea is. But it's hard to imagine that they will put North Korea on the back burner. I know there's a lot of concern among Korea watchers, both in South Korea and also in Washington and in the United States. But considering the gravity of the situation with North Korea's advancing nuclear weapons capability, I'd be very surprised if they sidelined this issue.
Okay, Andrei, if you were a up-and-coming, ambitious US official, would you want to take the job of US Special Envoy for North Korea?
No, because definitely not. Well, maybe it's better than nothing. If an alternative is to remain an assistant professor somewhere in the Midwest, but alternatively, I would probably not. Because this job is not going to produce any sellable results. Even worse, the results which are objectively good for the long-term interest of the United States of America are likely to look, well, not particularly attractive to the majority of the political class right now. So if you do something and if you succeed, everybody will criticize you and put all blame for everything on you. Alternatively, you don't achieve anything, you spend few years, and everybody believes you are a loser. So my advice, don't go.
Chad, if I may add just quickly, Andrei raises a really important point. And it's because, in the beginning, that position was considered to be quite attractive, even within the American Foreign Service, within the State Department. In the beginning, I mean, very way back when, decades ago. And that's where a lot of the action was and a lot of excitement and drama. But over time, quickly, I think even maybe right after the Bush administration, my sense has been that for career diplomats, it's not an attractive position. And typically you would have a career diplomat or someone who's been in the government for a long time be appointed to that position, but it's because it's not career advancing. And for career diplomats, as all of our panelists know, it's you're either up or you're out, and you want to keep going up the ranks and contributing to service. And so that's one. And so I think that's why during the Trump administration, I mean, for one, they didn't really have much of a pool to choose from. But two, I think that was a factor why the previous administration brought someone in from the outside, somebody who's not staking their future government career on that one position, because you cannot win. Just as Andrei said, you can't win with we have not seen anyone win with North Korea so far, but also American domestic politics. You'll be criticized left and right either way, no matter what you try to do.
Yes.
And so we've got this ongoing US policy review. We learned about it beginning early January after inauguration. It's nearly April 15th, North Korea's famous Day of the Sun annual holiday. The Trump administration's policy review was out the door early April, maximum pressure, total sanctions. I'm curious what you both expect from this policy review. We've heard from sources it will be out April 15th as well. Interesting timing. So yeah, I'm curious what you both think we should expect from this. Andrei?
Well, to start with, I believe that the United States have very little choice. They have had very little choice for, well, maybe 15 years or more. They can either follow the line, which is known as strategic patience. That is, pretends that there is nothing between the DMZ and Yalu River, sort of sea space. Do nothing in hope that sanctions will deliver the magic, the miracle. Of course, it's clear that sanctions are not going to work. Yes, tough sanctions like now, unusually tough, create serious problems, but these problems are not serious enough to persuade North Korean government to change its attitude to the nuclear weapons. They are nuclear, they remain nuclear. So we have strategic patience options, and we have kind of diplomacy option, which means try to negotiate with North Koreans some kind of deal which is bound to be imperfect. The problem is you cannot negotiate a deal with North Korea on denuclearization. I have been saying it for 20 years, maybe 15 or 17. Denuclearization of North Korea is not going to happen, period. North Korea will always be a nuclear state. The nuclear issue has no perfect solution. And this is a trick. If you try to negotiate, you have to do concessions which will be easily seen by the US domestic political opinion, by the US Congress and US media as appeasement, as kowtowing to the evil Oriental tyrant. And it's politically not very good. In the long run, of course, it's the only way to go, but it's troublesome and it doesn't pay in the short run. So there is always a great temptation to follow the strategic patience line. So Americans are doing nothing, they maintain sanctions regime, Chinese are basically violating the regime and keeping North Korea afloat. North Korean engineers are working hard to penetrate, to create systems which will eventually be capable of penetrating the US anti-missile defenses. I can assure you they will be there, but nobody will be criticizing White House for being weak or kowtowing to Oriental tyrants. And because in all democracies, policy tends to be, well, determined largely by the short-term considerations, it's what is likely. So I would say more strategic patience, especially because candidate Biden criticized Trump for being engaged in the talks.
Duyeon, what do you think we should expect?
Well, I think they've given us, enough clues publicly in public comments to reveal their core pillars or their core principles. And the details are really that really remains to be seen and how they try to achieve those goals. But the key principles really are a mix of diplomacy and pressure, and again, like how they come up with the configurations and those details. Like Andrei makes a good point about sanctions, and we'll have to see if they do continue with sanctions or try to increase sanctions. We'll have to see what the objective of those sanctions are. I know we talk a lot about we need to use sanctions or we don't need to, or they work or they don't work, but it really depends on what the objective of sanctions are. We've seen in the past, I mean, of course, at a minimum, one objective is to try to dry up sources of funding for North Korea's nuclear weapons program. And there are many reports now saying North Korea is earning millions, if not billions of dollars through cyber crimes and cryptocurrency and all those illicit financial activities online. And so that's one. Or, I do remember during the Obama administration, of course, the sanctions then were really nowhere near where they are now, but they tried to use sanctions to bring North Korea back to the dialogue table. So, I do believe that there are no American sanctions officials or decision makers who are using sanctions to topple the regime. I don't think that's really part of the calculation here. They're not intended to stifle the welfare of the North Korean people. It's really been more targeted, and they try to use them more strategically. But the problem is that North Korea has basically been blurring the lines of where their sources of funding comes from. So, with their whole Pyeongjin strategic line of the dual nuclear and economic development strategy, like they're using a lot of their revenue from their economy and other sectors in their economy to then use them to fund their nuclear weapons program. And so that's where it gets tricky, and that's where it might look like sanctions officials are targeting the economy that target the people, but that's not the case. They're targeting sources of nuclear weapons funding. And so again, I really have to defer to, despite what we've been hearing through our sources, I do need to emphasize that we need to wait to hear more from the administration. We'll have to see if it comes in some sort of announcement, or if it comes in the form of just us seeing them enact, put into action, and hear and see bits and pieces of it. That all remains to be seen.
Okay. Andrei, why should any of the BCCK members on this call care about the future of North Korea diplomacy post policy review? It sounds like, frankly, we've been on this train before, and we are going to see another 4 years of mild confrontation, minor crises. Why should anyone really care in South Korea from the business community about where this is all going?
I would answer cynically, even though it probably slightly diminishes my chances of being invited for hopefully eventually real breakfast with the British Chamber of Commerce. That is, now I have to use substitute. Having said that, I think that they should not care that much. Why they should care is to cool down their headquarters if they represent some or big companies stationed based overseas, or to cool basically their partners, because when we have what is essentially a minor crisis, very few people in Korea really care about. Usually media creates all this great hype, and we can read all these headlines saying Korean peninsula is on the brink of war. And it's bad for business. It's bad for family life. And their, aging mothers somewhere far away can start calling them in the middle of the night. And it's not good. Second, it's less likely now, but in the long run, it's also good. They should be careful with basically, again, of what they are going to hear from the local politicians. Because we have to understand, when the politicians and diplomats in Korea, and not only in Korea, but in regard to Korea, talk about denuclearization, they don't mean it. When they talk about unification, they by no means mean it. And the talks about North-South reconciliation also should not produce too much excitement. So panics, well, all these panicking reports about coming war, we should understand that it's highly unlikely. And at the same time, all the talks about reconciliation and the great North-South co-prosperity sphere, massive investment, and great business prospects of dealing with North Korea, it's equally, well, just noise. So people should keep it in mind that, well, as you have said, most likely we are going to have status quo until some black swan will arrive, and when it will arrive, it will be neither beautiful reconciliation or war, but something very different.
Duyeon, why do you think that this time around Pyongyang has so far not tested the new Biden administration with, large-scale nuclear tests, long-range missile tests, you name it? It hasn't done the types of things that we've tended to see
China.
Can you can hear me okay? Yeah. I'm just
Sure.
curious what you think the sort of restraint may be due to.
So, we can only, of course, speculate, but if we try to make an informed guesstimate, I think first and foremost, they're very internally focused. And, they're still dealing with, they claim the effects of existing sanctions. They're dealing with COVID. I think COVID is the biggest challenge for them right now on their economy, because they've put themselves into self-isolation. And it's clear that North Korea sees the coronavirus as the biggest threat to their survival, not what they call hostile US policy. And so I think in that sense, they might be less externally focused in terms of trying to grab attention or whatnot. But we've still seen them test cruise missiles and short-range ballistic missiles. And I really would not play down, especially the recent short-range missiles. Those are the ones, Kim Jong-un in January emphasized that he wants to develop tactical nuclear weapons. And these are shorter range missiles compared to the long ones. And these are the types of, if they're able to mount nuclear warheads onto these missiles, these are the missiles that are being that are used in war or that can start a war actually, and they target South Korea, the range. And so in that sense, South Koreans and also Americans and other foreigners living in South Korea should care about that. And it sounds pretty clear that North Korea for now is focusing on weapons that can actually be used in battle, and the battleground would be the Korean Peninsula. Why they're not testing long-range missiles, I mean, it's really anybody's guess, but first technologically, maybe they're not ready to do it, who knows, or maybe they really are, perhaps they think maybe even President Biden would respond very firm or harshly to an ICBM test. And so so they're trying to go below that threshold. But at the same time, I mean, Kim Jong-un has a way to save his face for not domestically, for not testing an ICBM yet, because he did declare a few years ago that his nuclear force is complete. And so in that sense, he can use that logic and say, oh, we don't need to test yet, or we don't need to test for a while. Same thing with a nuclear device. But at the same time, they still need, if they really want to have operational nuclear weapons, both long-range missiles and short-range missiles, they have to keep testing. So they're always going to have a military imperative to keep testing because of the technology on the technological front. Then I think comes in the political calculation of, for example, when the timing of these tests and what type of a weapon to test. And I think that would be the indicator of what type of message they might want to send externally. So, each time they test a weapon or some sort of missile, I think they have multiple objectives. But for now, I think the domestic angle is heavier than the international focus.
Andrei, what's wrong with North Korea having nuclear weapons?
What was wrong? What do you mean?
Yeah, what's wrong with North Korea having nuclear weapons? Why are we focused so much on this challenge? Tell us what you think is wrong.
Yes. Well, I would say what is wrong, first of all, the proliferation is probably bad. There is a school of thought. There are scholars who really argue that proliferation is not bad for stability, that if everybody has nuclear weapons, the world will become safer because nobody will touch anybody. Well, if we look at the crimes as basically the firearms statistics in the United States, well, I'm a bit skeptical. I'm afraid that if such a world, probability of nuclear conflict will increase dramatically. So basically, most people, however, agree that proliferation is bad. Many people would make reservation for their own country. Well, it's bad when everybody else gets nuclear weapons, but it's okay for us. Nonetheless, basically, it's a kind of the world consensus that generally is bad. And we have seen 4 cases, well, depends how you count, 5 if you count South Africa, when the non-proliferation regime was challenged. I'm talking about India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, and South Africa. And of all these challenges, North Korean challenge is the most risky. Because, first, all other self-declared nuclear states, well, let's be honest, they're a nuclear state. United Nations cannot cancel laws of physics. They have workable nuclear devices, with the exception of South Africa, which surrendered it. All these states developed, they never joined the non-proliferation regime. They have never been members of the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty. When the non-proliferation regime was established, all the states but North Korea said explicitly that it was essentially a conspiracy of the great powers to ensure that their military superiority would last forever. And all these countries openly stated that probably one day they would develop their own nuclear weapons. North Korea is different. They joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They used it to acquire some technology and then they withdrew. It's a highly dangerous precedent. Second, North Korea is seen by a majority as a country less predictable than all other self-declared or let's say new nuclear states. And last, but definitely not least, there are good reasons to believe that North Korean nuclear weapons have been developed against, above all, the United States of America, the world's sole superpower. Well, maybe they are going to get a company very soon in the shape of China, which is probably also, by the way, on North Korea's target list, because all other countries develop nuclear weapons essentially against their neighbors. I'm talking about India against Pakistan, Pakistan against India, Israel against Arab countries nearby. So it's a global challenge. So combination of all this, the basically, I would say, a cynical abuse of the non-proliferation, well, general fears of non-proliferation, or of proliferation, the cynical abuse of non-proliferation treaty by the North Koreans, and the fact that this is against really serious players who are bound to be unhappy, all three reasons combined make North Korean issue especially important. And finally, if it happens, and it's likely happening, we are going sooner or later to see a lot of new nuclear states, nuclear Burma, nuclear Vietnam, nuclear Taiwan, name it.
Chad, if I can jump in real quick here. I agree with what Andrea has been saying. One is the risk of conflict by miscalculation, an accidental conflict. We really don't know how North Korea is managing their nuclear weapons in a safe and secure way. And also, because of potential misperception. So for example, if the US or the US and South Korea are mobilizing their forces in a defensive way, whether it's through exercises or if North Korea notices some sort of movement which is actually defensive and not preparing for war or an attack, North Korea could misperceive it as offensive preparations and try to fire the first nuclear weapon first, to strike first because of fear of being attacked. So that type of miscalculation, and also I do remember a time, this was during the Obama administration, when a senior official said to me once, whether North Korea has one nuclear bomb or 10, it really doesn't matter. They have the bomb. And I said, it actually matters. Numbers really matter. The more North Korea is able to produce these weapons, the more options that they're given in terms of the types of weapons they can make and how they can use these weapons, both during peacetime and in wartime. So even during using nuclear weapons in peacetime is also a very important factor, which is, for example, the potential for nuclear blackmail, for coercion, and also, it makes it harder to negotiate with North Korea because they build up leverage, and that's one of the reasons why they're doing this. And so it's really hard to believe North Korea entirely when they say that their nuclear weapons are for defensive purposes only, because really they can get more ideas and then how to use them offensively if they wanted to. The second point and the final point I'd like to make is, as much as you hear a lot of experts, very smart colleagues that we have saying denuclearization really is unrealistic, even if that may be true, or let's say denuclearization is not in the cards in our lifetime, or at least anytime soon, it's very risky and dangerous for an American government to say that publicly and to make that a policy. So there's a reason why every American administration, and even this Biden administration, declares that denuclearization is the policy and the ultimate objective. One, because that's what we want to see, but also if denuclearization is not the final goal for an American administration, then that basically tells that raises anxieties in South Korea and Japan, and it tempts them to flirt with their own nuclear options. Perhaps they want to go nuclear as well because of fear of abandonment and fear of just from North Korean potential attack. That could also then, if Japan then goes nuclear or seriously considers it, then that will make China react, and then Taiwan could react, and so you have a potential nuclear arms race. But also, not to mention, it really undermines America's credibility, America's non-proliferation leadership and credentials. If any future U.S. administration then declares that denuclearization is out of the cards, so even if we are negotiating with North Korea, and even if denuclearization does not seem to be, something that can be achieved anytime soon within a few years, which really will not, realistically, we still need to have that as the ultimate objective.
Andrei, do you see any creative way the United States could use diplomacy in the short to medium term with North Korea to alter the emerging strategic balance and great power rivalry that we're seeing with China, US-China relations?
Well, probably I first would continue basically what Duyeon just said. I would say that A, denuclearization is not possible. B, for the United States and the generally speaking world community, it's highly undesirable to openly and explicitly accept this truth. So no matter how negotiations are going to be conducted and what is the real goal of the negotiations, they should be packaged and officially presented as negotiations whose distant goal is denuclearization of North Korea.
So why not do it? Could the US not do it in the same way it approaches the Middle East? We have Israel unofficially with nuclear weapons, but we also have this concept of a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons. Could it be spun in a regional way that doesn't focus just on the Korean Peninsula?
I don't see how it's going to work in Korea. I think what is likely is essentially some kind of Hanoi deal, but not exactly on the conditions the North Korean side suggested back then. So Americans will agree to raise sanctions against North Korea, and in exchange, North Koreans will physically destroy a significant part of their research and development, as well as manufacturing facilities for the nuclear weapons and missiles. Of course, the exact conditions the North Korean side suggested in Hanoi are not acceptable, but they have to give, basically, they have to surrender much more, but something along this line. Sanctions are lifted in exchange of significant part of their nuclear facilities destroyed. It will freeze or maybe even slightly reduce their nuclear potential. And this is the greatest achievement which we can realistically hope for. And such actions will require a great deal of political courage from the American administration. And of course, everything will be presented as the first step on the long way to denuclearization, which probably will happen in the 24th century.
Out of 10, 1 out of 10 to 10 out of 10, what would you say, both of you, the probability of that kind of deal being signed off in the next 4 years? Duyeon?
I'll have to give you a long answer, not a number, because it's more complex. As you know, these issues are very complex and there are many layers. It's hard to give a black and white answer to every question. I think the big question mark is whether North Korea would be willing to accept the type of concessions that the United States might be willing to offer in terms of sanctions relief in exchange for North Korea's existing offer on the table, if it still exists in Hanoi, of giving their Yongbyon nuclear complex. And they have not even defined exactly what that means. Is it all of the whole complex, or is it just a few buildings that they allow? So that has to be defined as well. I think the Yongbyon is worth something, worth trading for something. And the big question mark is, what is that something? From an American perspective, I really think that, the Biden administration should not give away too much in exchange for just Yongbyon, because the real drivers of North Korea's nuclear program are outside that complex, are in places that are hidden, are not declared, are not disclosed. And I think we have to ask ourselves, why is North Korea willing to give up something that many perceive to be the heart of the program? Well, it's because it's not the heart of the program. They're willing to give it up because they don't need it anymore. And so in that sense, I think proportionate bargaining is really important. I've done a lot of writing on this, on what kinds of concessions to exchange with what with North Korea, and how to put values on these things. But one way is to offer some time-bound sanction exemptions and waivers. So for example, 1-year exemption on textiles, for example, in exchange for, and I would actually say Yongbyon plus something else, not just Yongbyon. But the question is, will North Korea accept that type of counter proposal? And frankly, as skeptical, I think we should try it, but I'm still skeptical, because North Korea has been acting and talking like they want the big ticket items, and they're going to want more for less. They're going to want to give less and extract more. And so that's really where the battle will be in terms of the negotiations. And that's where the art of negotiations will have to come into place. But the problem right now, since the Hanoi summit, is North Korea has been refusing face-to-face negotiations. And they've been placing unreasonable preconditions for talks, to even just talk, to get together and talk and have a conversation. And so that's the first challenge that the Biden administration will face, is how to actually have a conversation, a meaningful conversation with North Korea, and to even try to discuss types of scenarios and types of barters. So that's going to be the first step.
Andrei, out of 10, give me a number.
Because Duyeon is absolutely correct. Let's say not the deal we have discussed, but some possible partial deal. Well, maybe 2, maybe hardly more, maybe 3 more,
Unlikely
like
then.
2. Yeah, but again, Duyeon is absolutely correct, because all this, if I just said that exchange of some facilities for some sanctions relief, but then there are so many questions that even somebody with rather shallow knowledge of the issue like me can deliver a 1-hour-long speech, and the real professional will probably talk non-stop for few days. So there are many very important issues related to this general kind of scheme, but something along this line, 2 out of 10 maybe, not high.
Now, one of the questions on my mind is about how China sees the North Korea issue. Like, what do you think, Andrei, China's goal for North Korea will be over the next 4 years? Is it going to use it as a tool in this ongoing rivalry with the United States, or is it going to play a more mature denuclearization first role when it comes to managing
Neither. I would say that for China, mature role is not denuclearization first, because they see North Korean nuclear issues as everybody's issue, but above all, American issue. And mature Chinese position is China first. It's what I would expect. And from the Chinese point of view, first, they, in spite of confrontations, they are not adventurous enough to use. Fortunately, they are not such risk-prone to use North Korea as a kind of a tool to blackmail Americans or whichever. Most likely, they need status quo. Because right now, with confrontation with the United States, they need basically what they have always needed, but they need it even more. They need a stable, divided, and ideally non-nuclear Korean peninsula. But for China, denuclearization is a very distant third in the items on their agenda. Therefore, what I would expect, they will keep North Korea afloat, but providing it with limited but sufficient aid. Judging by everything we know about current situation, this is exactly what they are doing right now. They need North Korea to be stable. They dislike North Korea. They despise North Korean government pretty much as much as American. Basically, in this regard, they are not different from Americans, but it's irrelevant. They need this country, this regime to stay afloat. On the other hand, when you ask the question, why did not North Korea stage any kind of new test recently? Because it was logical to expect, and personally, I did expect that North Korea would have some kind of, welcome lunch for Mr. Biden. I think that possible explanation is Chinese intervention. China cannot fully control North Korea, but now, when North Korea's survival is increasingly dependent on the shipment of the Chinese aid, North Korea can really postpone some exercise, some tests, even if their engineers badly need such tests, just because it's what China demands. So what I would say, China will try to keep situation quiet, stable, and to make sure that North Korean government will not do anything excessively provocational, because China doesn't want a confrontation, but at the same time will send to Pyongyang a paycheck, I would say a welfare payment regularly without many questions asked. It's what I would expect.
And Duyeon, what about South Korea? Like, what do you think the South Korean goal for the rest of the Moon administration is, and why is the North so disinterested?
So President Moon has about a year left until next May in office, and I think we can expect they're going to want to step on the gas on trying to jumpstart summitry again, and they've wanted to do a four-way summit at the Tokyo Olympics, but now that's out the door because North Korea has withdrawn from the Tokyo Olympics, and so I think it's safe to say, really, frankly and bluntly, that they're quite desperate for a breakthrough on the peace front. They want to speed up the peace process much faster than the denuclearization process, because in their minds, they think front loading on concessions will help change North Korean behavior. And, I personally disagree, and there are many others who do, but then there are many others who do agree. And so I think the Moon government is going to want to look for opportunities and ways to facilitate a US North Korea summit. But again, the Biden administration has been correct to say that, well, the North Korea is going to have to work hard for it, basically, if they want FaceTime with another American president. I think North Korea has, to your other question, has really been bullying and coercing South Korea. It's a missed opportunity on their part, because I think the Moon government is perhaps the only type of administration that would be North Korea's biggest advocate. But North Korea has basically cut the Moon government out of the process since the Trump administration. We've been hearing lots of stories from interlocutors and those with informed information that North Korea is basically upset that the Moon government raised its expectations too high, that the South Korean government basically led North Korea to believe that Trump would accept North Korea's offer to give Yongbyon in exchange for the lifting of UN Security Council sanctions. And I think that was frankly a miscalculation on the Moon government's part too, because as far as I could tell, there were no indications that the Trump administration would do that whatsoever in the lead up to Hanoi, and that's exactly what happened. That was not acceptable. And so apparently North Korea is upset about that. But also perhaps North Korea, because they started this whole summit tree with previous President Trump, they probably thought that they already have a direct channel to the White House, so they don't need South Korea anymore. But they're basically trying to make, even though they're upset and they're bullying South Korea, I think they're still trying to make South Korea work even harder for them. And that what they want to see is the Moon government basically breaking from Washington and really trying to get what North Korea wants.
Now, one thing we haven't really talked about is the internal situation in North Korea. You touched upon it, Duyeon, but obviously the country's been closed to international trade since last summer. Andrei, how would you characterize the state of North Korea's economy, and are there any risks that come from that?
Well, sorry state, definitely. Obviously, we have serious economic decline, provoked partially by the sanctions, partially by, to some extent, recent political decisions, but above all by the very tough anti-quarantine measures. So because countries essentially stopped all kinds of exchanges with the outside world, North Korea does not trade anymore. They don't get anything from overseas. They don't sell anything overseas. There are all indicators all the indicators say that the situation is deteriorating. However, I would not excessively panic. I would remind that exchange rate, which in North Korea, for those who don't know, is actually commercially kind of determined by the market, not by the state. It's they have actually free sales of foreign currency since long ago. The foreign exchange rate is relatively stable. There are changes, but not that dramatic. And the basic food prices are stable as well, probably due to the undeclared but very significant shipment of aid and liquid fuel from China. So what we should expect? We should expect that economy will shrink, maybe significantly. Living standards will go down very significantly, but we should not be afraid of, say, a famine, because if things will get really that bad, China will probably intervene and will increase the amount of aid. And so basically what we say, well, I would, a long-term crisis, which is likely to continue for the foreseeable future, but not a disaster.
I think there are many people who would be very worried, and of course I am too, of the welfare of the North Korean people, the general population, during this pandemic. I at the same time, North Korea has proven to be so resilient. The famine of the 90s, I would argue, it was a much harder time than it is now. And we also are hearing anecdotes from interlocutors that North Korea actually has been receiving some shipments from China, such as rice. They've been they've been quarantining the rice supplies at the port. So China would drop them off at the port, and North Korea would keep them there for about 2 weeks, and then send their people over to fetch the bags of rice, for example. So there are ways that North Korea is trying to adapt and cope. Perhaps they'll go back to, if they have not already, perhaps they'll go back to their old barter system that they've been used to. It also seems pretty apparent that based on Kim Jong-un's speech or address in January, or his report, that they're making a U-turn on their economic policy. So, their quasi-market style activities that were one source of economic growth, it sounds like he wants to go back to centralization instead. And we're also, again, as I mentioned before, the money that they earn from cyber crimes, we don't know exactly how, or I don't know exactly how much, but there must be ways that would be one way, not only to fund their nuclear weapons program, but perhaps they could be using it for other means too. And so I would not be too worried yet about a potential collapse of North Korea. I do worry about the health of the broader public, the population, because are they actually getting the type of needs that the elites are getting during this time?
Okay, so it's 9:50 now. We have the last 10 minutes, I believe, for Q&A, Sean.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chad, and thank you to Andrei and Duyeon as well. Yeah, so we have a couple of questions. So you can put your hand up if you would like to answer it, or I can just pick someone. So the first actually is referencing the fact that today we covered North Korea in relation to China, and also, of course, in relation to the US administration, but not really with regards to Russia. So maybe Andrew is a good person to answer this one. But I guess the question is around what is the role of Russia? Is there a role, and if there is, then to what extent should we see any change or involvement of Russia? And I mean, maybe while you're there, I think covering Japan is also might be interesting.
Should I start? Yeah. Well, first of all, something which has to be kept in mind, Russia plays a very secondary role in these developments, partially as a result of their objective situation, partially because of its own choice. Because being involved with North Korea is costly. China now is spending probably about $1 to $2 billion on the aid to North Korea and get very little but stability and buffer zone it needs. Right now, we should keep in mind that Russia's trade with North Korea is roughly 50 times. Actually, well, if you take official trade, something like 60, 70 times smaller than North Korea's trade with China. Before all these changes began, around 2015, Chinese trade with North Korea was about $6 billion, and Russian trade was about, well, $100 million, 60 times difference, not 16, 16. And if you look at the amount of aid provided to North Korea, you see roughly the same level of difference. Because for Russia, North Korea is a very secondary issue. Basically, Russian goal are very similar to the goals of China. That is, Russia also wants stable, divided, and ideally non-nuclear Korean Peninsula. But the general significance of this goal, the value of Korea for Russia is much lower than value of Korea for China. So Russia is happily in backseat and follows the Chinese line. It will be just a minor exaggeration to say that Russian policy towards North Korea is manufactured in Beijing. And by the way, it makes perfect sense because interests are same, but stakes are much lower. Japan. Japan is in pretty much hopeless situation, also very secondary, because Japanese major tool of the Japanese diplomacy are money, a lot of money. But they cannot use it. They cannot do any kind of deal with North Korea. And North Koreans are not interested in dealing with Japan unless they are getting some kind of, I would say, material reward. And right now, because of the sanctions and because of a fast increasing significance of the alliance with the United States, Japan cannot be engaged in any kind of, dealing with North Korea in the short term, maybe even midterm. So, and on top of that, we have abduction issue, which is pretty much hopeless. I would say almost as hopeless, well, a bit less, but not much less, as the issue of as the nuclear issue itself. No solutions are in sight. So I would say that both Russia and Japan will be marginalized. Japan will probably will play sort of independent role trying to push United States towards probably harsher line, and Russia probably will just, follow what China will do.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And then I wanted then to Duyeon, and also, Andrei, feel free to jump in as well. But I think one of the questions is around, obviously there's been, the right wing has been victorious in the election of the Seoul mayor. And obviously that may, speculation is that will lead to a change of from the left to the right for the upcoming presidential election. And then of course, Moon has sort of staked his legacy around his relations with North Korea. So do you see, what do you see for his policy towards North Korea and his ability to, possibly try and build some sort of legacy outside of maybe, what we've speculated around the US, if that's possible?
Well, surprisingly, first of all, I would not overestimate the significance of the disastrous defeat of the left on the recent elections, because, well, we still have 1 year, and the recent defeat was largely a result of the local political situation, suicide of the former mayor of Seoul, and so on. Long story. So basically, I would say that if you ask me, I will probably bet on the victory of the left on the next presidential elections, in spite of the results in Seoul. But indeed, the possible recover, I would say, it looks possible that the right will basically be back in the blue house. It's more likely it's personally, I believe it's still maybe 40%, 30% probability, but it's real. You know, how will it influence the South Korean policy and especially North Korean policy? South Korean administration, Moon administration, will probably continue what they have been doing for years. That is trying to engage in all kinds of diplomacy. They basically want to shower North Korea with aid. They are ready to send truckloads of $100 bills to North Korea. But they cannot do it because they are afraid of problems with the United States more than they are afraid of problems with North Korea. Having said that, they will try to do all kind of summitry, online summit, all kind of negotiations, everything. It's not new, and it's unrelated to the recent elections. What is new? I will not be surprised if North Korean government changes its attitude, because they have reasons to be basically cold towards the Moon administration, but they understand that if conservatives get back to power, North Korea will be in greater trouble. So they probably would like to assist. They would feel like assisting the left, and they understand that probably the only way they can do it is to help President Moon shortly before the elections to stage few kind of spectacular events, show-like events with a lot of nebulous declarations, a lot of smile, talk about reconciliation, beautiful projects, peace system, peace regime, blah, 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 blah. We have seen it many times. And such a wonderful political show will probably get Mr. Moon and his party, not him, of course, he cannot run for re-election, but his party, maybe an additional 1 or 2% of vote, and this 1 or 2% might become decisive because the next race might be very tight, very close. So briefly, I would say that now I would not be surprised if North Koreans start basically become much more kind of willing to consider future proposals of the South Korean administration. And they will stage a couple of such shows just to decrease chances of conservatives' victory. But once again, it's a long way, and well, it was a brilliant success of the right. They finally have a good candidate. They finally getting support. What is vital, they're getting support of the youth, serious support, first time in decades. Having said that, I still, if you ask me to bet, I would bet on the next victory of the left on the next elections.
So Sean, I will not be as bold as betting on an election because it's way too soon, and politics, as you know, is so fluid. But this, I would be very cautious to assume that the Seoul and Busan mayoral elections are any indicator of who might win next year in the presidential, which party might win in the presidential elections. I think this time these elections were basically a referendum on Moon and his party, and they basically reflect the South Korean public's, even his supporters, their disappointment and their anger at Moon and his party, because the South Korean people's welfare really has declined. Political corruption is still rampant. Koreans are criticize and are upset that they say that liberal democratic values have deteriorated, and the party's image really is plagued by sexual harassment. Now that said, it does not mean that the votes do not mean that they like the opposition any better, because the conservative base is also the party or parties, they're extremely fragmented. They're also trying to recover from their own ghosts of the past and their image. And so, it really remains to be seen. I think the Moon and his party either has to fail even more until next year, or the opposition, the conservative opposition, will have to unite and field a presidential candidate that really would win back the trust of the South Korean people. Now, in the remaining year, I think the key right now is, even though, as I said earlier, the Moon government will want to step on the gas on peace, its peace initiative, to leave behind a legacy, they're going to need the first thing they need is a willing partner in the north, and North Korea just has not been willing to cooperate, and so that will be key. Another issue is we've seen the ruling party pass a ton of laws at warp speed. We'll have to see if they continue to do that in the National Assembly in the remaining year. And this could have implications on foreign policy and inter-Korean relations, especially if they pass more laws, not just the leaflet ban, but also if they try to enshrine the summit agreements during Moon's time, the inter-Korean summit agreements and the military agreement. If they try to enact those into law, then if there is a change in government in terms of if the conservatives do win, it would be, their hands will really be tied because of laws, and so they'll have to try to peel back and lift and reverse those laws. But again, there's so many that the ruling party has been passing that it's going to take a very long process, and not to mention they're going to have to need enough seats in the National Assembly to reverse some of those. But as we near the South Korean presidential election next year, we'll also have to, this is a point that Andrei made, but he touched upon this too, but we'll have to see how North Korea, if North Korea tries to assert and inject itself into the South Korean election as well. We've seen that happen in the past. North Korea likes to divide the South Korean public between the left and right even further. They also like to use it to drive a wedge between South Korea and the United States. And so as we get closer to the election, we'll have to see how North Korea tries to do that.
Yeah, interesting. Well, that's it in terms of time. So I'd like to thank you all. Thanks, Chad, for fantastic moderation, and Andrei and Duyeon as well for your insights. As always, there is a lot of the questions have been answered by you guys, but a lot of questions prompt more questions, and it seems like we may have a return to sort of strategic patience, but with that's sort of to be seen, I guess. So we'll look ahead to that and maybe invite you back next year to discuss how right or wrong we all were in terms of our thoughts on this topic. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. And we'll be back very shortly with another webinar. And Andrei, you're always welcome back, whatever you say, it's fine.